testing the mood of the world's second most populous nation. India's ruling Congress party is punished in state polls. A protest vote over corruption and the economy, all a sign of things to come in national elections. This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Jane Dutton. Welcome to the programme. It's a country of more than 1.2 billion people, and India is projected to overtake China as the world's most populous nation by 2030. So deciding who is in charge is of enormous importance domestically and globally. National elections are due to take place by May next year. In the meantime, polls have been held in 5 heartland states, serving as a crucial test of current public opinion. Voting has been taking place in Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Delhi and Mizoram. And it is the Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, making strong political gains at the expense of the ruling Indian National Congress. The two parties are preparing for what's been described as the most important national elections in 20 years. To our discussion in a moment after we hear from Sourav Roy in New Delhi.
This is the last phase of state elections for India until this country goes to a general election poll within the next 6 months. It was a chance for political parties to really lay it out for the public and put themselves in a position to say this is what we stand for. As far as the BJP were concerned, they seem to have done very well in this last phase. And they worked on a premise that they needed to see clean politics, and they attacked the Congress party for what they described as them being corrupt and not serving the people. Certainly allegations that the Congress party have denied, but it doesn't seem to have worked. The Congress party lost quite handsomely across the board. The one big success story in this election phase has been the AAP party. They fought mainly in Delhi, and they will be a force to be reckoned with come the general election. The AAP is the Aam Aadmi Party, the ordinary man's party, inspired by Anna Hazare, the man who for the last 2 years has been on-off a hunger strike, complaining about the way politics is run in this country. It's inspired civil society and many politicians to defect to him, and they've done very well in the Delhi region and are expected to be a very loud voice, certainly in the capital area, and also as they take their message across the country. And all eyes now will be on the 2014 general election. It's going to be too close to call, with Narendra Modi, the candidate for the BJP, and the Congress party and its allies still to nominate a prime ministerial candidate. The public are watching to see what will happen next. For Inside Story, I'm Sourav Roy in New Delhi.
Let's bring in our guest now in New Delhi, Narayanan Madhavan, Associate Editor of the Hindustan Times newspaper. And joining us from Singapore is Sourav Roy, an Asian affairs analyst and columnist with the Huffington Post. Welcome to Inside Story. Madhavan, quite a setback for the ruling party. How are Indians responding to this news?
Well, there is jubilation on the streets of Delhi. You know, there's a party that was simply not present 1 year ago. It's a child that is not yet won, more or less, and they're playing guitars and banging congos. So these are a completely new force in Indian politics. It shows the maturing of what you could call urban politics in India, which has historically been dominated by the rural belt. Now, in 1/3 of India now is urban. So my expectation is the Aam Aadmi Party, which in English would mean the common man's party, is emerging as a major urban force, because 1/3 of India is roughly now urban, and urban areas seem to be having their own issues about corruption and inefficiency in government, and most of all officials of the government who are not accessible. So this is a sort of a mini French Revolution, as it were. You know, it represents a certain rise of a certain kind of a middle class in Indian politics, and it's within the democratic framework of a parliamentary system, but the way they are jumping about in the streets, you would think it was a revolution.
You certainly would. Sourav, what do you make of that analysis?
Oh, I think I completely agree with Madhavan. It's almost like what happened in Egypt with Wael Ghonim telling everybody that, you know, we're all Khalid Saeed, and then people coming down onto the streets and marching for democratization of Egypt. And this is precisely the same thing happening in India, where Arvind Kejriwal is telling everybody that we all have the power to make the change. We all have the power to stand against corruption. And as you can see from the results of the election, that people have made a choice and people have said what they want. And
what's been quite unusual this time is that there was a particularly high voter turnout. So it seems that people are getting possibly more confidence to make their voices heard.
Yes, absolutely. If you look at it, there was another option called none of the above in the elections, which means that if you do not agree that any of the candidates could lead the country or could represent you through the electoral franchise, you can just wash them away by pressing the button of none of the above. And that was something, a choice that came by the Supreme Court of India. However, it is only 1% of the people in Delhi that pressed that button. Everybody wanted a change, and everybody wanted a change for the positive way, and which is why they all opted for the Aam Aadmi Party, telling very clearly that we do want somebody who has the right ideals and the right value system to lead us.
Okay, I just want to give a little more detail about the main political parties at play here. As we've been saying, there's the Indian National Congress, founded way back in 1885. It has been in power for 2 terms with Manmohan Singh as Prime Minister. Then there's the Hindu Nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party, or the Indian People's Party, established in 1980. Its candidate for Prime Minister is Narendra Modi, the Chief Minister for the state of Gujarat, seen as more business-friendly. Hoping to take advantage of the traditional rivalry is the Aam Aadmi Party, or the Common Man's Party. We've been talking about that with our guests. A newcomer launched just over a year ago, campaigning on an anti-corruption platform and headed by the social activist and former civil servant Arvind Kejriwal. Madhavan, you were saying that the party there has already benefited, or you're saying that it's already doing incredibly well, but do you think it's benefited from this rivalry between the 2 main parties?
It's no longer a bipolar system as far as Delhi is concerned, and given that Aam Aadmi Party has ambitions to become a national party, and given that a third of India is now urban, which kind of responds to the kind of agenda that the AAP professes, including good governance, less garbage on the streets, no bribes for the ordinary things like getting electricity connections. So they are touching a chord somewhere, the right chord somewhere, and therefore we are seeing the emergence of what you would call a new third force in Indian politics.
Sourav, it certainly seems that the man-woman has had enough of what's going on. The fact that you've got to pay bribes for everything, to get your electricity switched on, to pick up a passport, on every single level you have to pay bribes.
Yeah, I think bribery and corruption became the tragedy of the commons, and everybody had to resort to bribery. It was taken as an accepted. I'm told that in some of the land deals in South India, on the official forms, there was a certain column which said blessing money, which effectively meant that that's the money that you have to give to the minister to receive his blessing in order to get the land deal through. And so with a situation like that, one is often rendered helpless. What do you have to do? Or what can you do? And that's why I think people got tired of it, and there comes a point when people vote and they make it a point that the change that they want starts at the individual level, which is by taking the choice of not voting in people or leaders who would force them to bribe or succumb to the system that exists as of now.
Well, I mean, how does India compare when it comes to corruption? According to Transparency International, it is ranked 94th out of 177 countries in a list of the most corrupt countries in the world. The same as last year. That's better, though, than neighbours Pakistan at 127 and Bangladesh at 136, but soured by a series of scams involving government officials, politicians and private companies. Sourav, how much does corruption cost India economically and from an international perception point of view?
First of all, to begin with, what a fantastic pool to be in, Pakistan, Bangladesh and India. I mean, these are countries where we know that public policies and the delivery system has failed miserably. The cost of corruption is incalculable. It costs not just in dollars or in terms of euros, it costs people their value systems, it costs people their trust, their confidence in the land that they were born in, and it also costs people their conviction that this is a land where I can do well. And when such kind of misery seeps in, I think it's a social decay that starts percolating. And with that as the background, I think everything gets affected. Economy gets affected. You have to bribe ministers. You have to bribe bureaucrats. You have to bribe government officials. And even in private sector organizations, people take it for granted that if I have to get a license, that I have to obtain a license, I'll just pay the government or I'll just pay the government official. That, I think, sets the entire economy on a backtrack, and that derails the sustainable development that India has been talking about as emerging as the next big economic power, and that's quite contrary to what India's stand is as of now.
Madhavan, you want to say something?
Yeah, the point is that China is also known to have corruption, and so does Russia. So it's not a simple equation of corruption alone here. What we've seen is the ruling party, the Congress party, has been embroiled in at least 3 major corruption scandals involving very senior politicians or coalition partners. That includes the allocation of spectrum for telecoms, allocation of coal for power, which is an important sector for India to fan economic growth. And then you also have the Commonwealth Games, which was some kind of a showpiece that ran into trouble. The games went on fine. It was a pride for India, but there was a lot of allegations about corruption. So this kind of it creates a disturbance in the minds of people about the character of the people who are governing them. And I think more than, apart from the day-to-day difficulties that have been pent up, giving rise to pent-up frustrations over the past 2 decades of high economic growth, I think the fact remains that there is also a very serious issue of the quality of men and women that will rule India. I think the growth of the media and the internet has fanned a new kind of imagination among youngsters. You were talking about India becoming the most populous nation. What it also means, there's a new generation on the rise. There's a demographic transition, and the younger generation will not take the old equations for granted. The old oligarchies of power are under threat. The old political families are being told that, hey, your time is over. I think that's a hidden message, and we'll see more of it going forward in the next year's general elections, I think.
Sourav, I mean, the fact that it is set to take over China as the most populous nation, whatever happens in India, is therefore significant.
Look, I can just put it in a different way. I'm an Indian who's living right next to China. I'm in Southeast Asia, and I see Chinese innovations, and I keep on monitoring news from China. Corruption in China goes punished. At the topmost level, there is a mandate that you have to punish corruption, and they're very strict about it, and they're very serious about it. However, corruption in India almost always ends up as a cover-up. So there's denials, there's the rhetoric, and so, it just gets stuck and, nothing moves ahead. In terms of what Madhavan interestingly pointed out about the Commonwealth Games, there was a joke that I read somewhere that it ended up to be the Commonwealth Gains instead of the Games. And that's how it actually ended up to be. Now, with the rise of the new generation that Madhavan is talking about, yes, it is true that people and the young generation especially want to revolt against it, and they want to take a stand against it, which is great. But if you try telling a youngster, for instance, India is a great country, but it's, corrupt and blah, 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 and all that stuff. Somehow, somewhere, I have noticed that the sense of nationalistic pride gets hurt. And that's where I think one needs to discern very carefully that it's not about the nationalistic pride, it's about what you want to do for the nation and how you want the nation to change. And that's where you need to look inwards and set your house in order first.
Do you think this nationalist pride, the fact that more youngsters are getting involved in the country, in the voting system, do you think that's helped push women's rights to the forefront? Because we've seen that for the first time in these elections.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, women's right is undeniable, and that is something which has to happen. Unfortunately, the plight of women in India, especially in the capital city of Delhi, has been very, very sad, and it's very disheartening. I would imagine that even today, for a young woman to go alone after midnight on the streets of Delhi would be unsafe. But with the elections that just happened, a lot of women found out that I can stand for myself, I can choose my own person, and I can be what I want to be. And that was the same for women candidates as well. I mean, look at it. We're a country which calls itself as the world's largest democracy. Sounds fantastic, but then we have to make 33% reservation for women to come into the parliament. Why? Because the representation of women in the parliament is dismally poor, and which is why you have to mandate a 33% representation. I think what is changing and what will change in times to come is women stepping forth by themselves, saying we want to be the face of change, and that's what I think this election, which has went by, has actually given them the confidence to do so.
Are we seeing that, Madhavan?
To tell you, I need to tell you. Yeah, I need to tell you that India was ruled by a woman prime minister for about nearly 2 decades, Indira Gandhi, let's not forget. So there's nothing wrong inherently in the culture in opportunities of women. But what is happening is that there is a feudal culture of patriarchal domination, as the feminists like to call it, in the rural areas and also semi-urban areas, and the growing education, urbanization, economic growth, and kind of awareness created by activist groups and the media is raising the aspirations to a point that people are standing up. So India is going through many revolutions. As you know, there is an American thinker, I think Stephen Cohen, said that India is going through 7 revolutions. You had the old Hindu hierarchies based on caste are breaking down, and then you have gender revolution, then you have an economic growth suddenly after 40 years of bottled up socialism. But the paradox of this is that some of the old community-based oligarchies have been using old clannish loyalties to come to power in India. And
okay,
that
sorry,
is
can I
being
just bring
questioned
in
right now.
Okay, can I bring in women on another level, though? I mean, it's almost a year or just over a year after that fatal, brutal rape, and I know all rape is brutal, but this was particularly brutal, that led to the death of the 23-year-old in India. How much has changed in the country because of that? Has it moved the criminal justice system along?
This is a social problem. This is a social problem that's not going to have overnight results. But what we see is a social ferment, and so something beyond law and order is being looked at in this problem. So you're talking about a new culture of awareness where the men have to change the way they look at things. You know, it's not just the rape scandal that you spoke about last year. You know, one of India's so-called new wave journalistic ventures, which was fighting crusades for the poor, its editor is in the dock for a sexual harassment charge. So we are going through some fundamental cultural change here, and it's not just about politics, it's about the fundamental way you look at things, and changing things that have been done in a certain way for centuries. And so we're going through what you might call interesting times.
Okay, let's change the conversation a little and move it on to the economy now and talk a little bit more about that. India is still Asia's 3rd largest economy, behind China and Japan. Not doing badly, but nothing like in recent years. Growth remained below 5% for the 4th consecutive quarter. Between July and September, just 2 years ago, India's economy expanded by close to 10%. Interest rates remain high at almost 8%. This in part to help tame inflation of some 7%. That's all hindering economic revival, while political uncertainty is putting off foreign investors. Let's get the thoughts now of Richard Varghese, an associate with Oxford Analytica, a global analysis and advisory firm. Richard joins us now from our London studios. Let's pick up on political uncertainty, Richard, and the sort of impact that has on the economy.
I think it's an important issue to be considered, but there are other bigger problems facing India over the next 12 to 24 months. For instance, the Fed's exit from quantitative easing is going to unmask some of the structural issues India has been able to avoid for some time for now. And as this liquidity abundance comes off, India will have to face up to those challenges. I think it's in this context political uncertainty would create bigger tensions and greater drag on the economic growth.
I know that economists are really looking to these upcoming elections. They say that these are possibly the most important. From what we've seen over the state elections, does it give you any sort of indication of the direction that India will go?
In terms of the elections, the main 2 coalitions coming back to power, so either a Congress-led coalition returning or BJP being sworn into power would make not much of a difference to the Indian economic outlook. Definitely you can expect some cheer in the equity markets for a BJP election victory.
Because they are seen as more business-friendly, aren't they? More willing to implement reforms, for example.
They are definitely seen more business-friendly, but also at the same time, Congress is currently seen or there is a bit of pessimism about their ability to deal with some of the economic issues facing the country. But with regards to actual reform that's going on in India, I think the pace will be almost same and the direction will remain the same. So in that sense, it's not going to make a big difference. For example, if you were to consider financial sector reforms that have been brought onto the agenda by Mr. Raghuram Rajan, it's likely to continue irrespective of which government comes back into power. For instance, I don't see Rajan being unappealing to BJP by any means. So in that sense, the direction of some of these issues will remain same, but definitely there is a different perspective towards both the coalitions at this point.
Madhavan, you were trying to get in there?
Yeah, I need to tell you that whoever comes to power will inherit a huge fiscal deficit. You already are looking at Standard & Poor and Moody's, the credit rating agencies, considering the idea of downgrading India to junk status. So whoever is the finance minister, irrespective of which party comes to power, is going to have a big headache, because India has been selling imported petroleum fuel like diesel and petrol much below the global prices, and therefore there's a hidden deficit that the new government will have to handle. And so I still think there's a lot of some hidden cost push inflation lurking in the system that needs to be addressed. So, except that the new government, hopefully, if it has a clear majority, will have the political will to push through some tough economic decisions. And these are not just about reforms in terms of deregulation, but it's also about giving a bitter pill to the people that have elected them. So it's not going to be a honeymoon year, I can tell you.
Sourav, I mean, whatever happens, it seems that we're going to be looking at a rather different India very soon.
Absolutely. You know, the Indians advertise around the world, the tourism board advertises by saying it, incredible India. And I would tell you, it is incredibly incredible to hear all these things. And the deficit that Madhavan is talking about is not just about the deficit in terms of fiscal sense. It is also the deficit in trust that people at the moment are witnessing because of failure in public policies and failure in delivery.
Richard, tell us a little bit more about the land grabs that we are seeing in certain states and the fact that this land is being handed over to private investors. I mean, is this something that works from an economic point of view, possibly not for India, but in the international community?
I think the story is more nuanced there, and I can't comment on any particular instance, but there is some leg for some assistance with getting businesses up and running, but that does not mean a land grab should be supported by any means.
So what do you think the country needs now for continued development and stability?
I think it needs to address some of these slow-burning supply-side constraints that's faced the economy for some time. Over the last 5 years or so, because of the abundant liquidity, India was able to tide over these issues. But what do I mean by structural issues or supply-side constraints facing the country right now? The inability of, or the lack of institutions to deal with infrastructure backlog, or not a very clear regulatory or institutional mechanisms to deal with mining and energy concerns, and even pushing ahead with some of the issues in the financial sector, not necessarily deregulation, but like making the sector a bit more competitive in some of these points. Yeah.
So fascinating times ahead in India. Thank you very much for talking to us, my guests, Narayanan Madhavan, Sourav Roy and Richard Varghese. Don't forget that you can find this program and many more at aljazeera.com. Just follow the links for shows and Inside Story. And I'm Jane Dutton. Thank you very much for watching.